Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Webdelics podcast. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and we're on a journey to find the truth about plant medicines, get rid of the myths, and change the narrative. With us today is Darren LeBaron. Darren is an educator, researcher, and event organizer based in the UK. Known around the world for his Shroomshop masterclasses, Darren is a keen mushroom cultivator, psychedelic researcher, and historian. He's been growing gourmet and medicinal mushrooms for over 10 years and has translated his homegrown experience into social enterprise. Darren, welcome to the show.
Nice one, Scott. I feel welcome. Thank you for the introduction. How you doing?
I am great, and I am all the better because we are going to have a conversation that I've been very excited about having. Now, the topic today is the history of psychedelics and why so much of it has been kept quiet. I'm just going to frame the episode a little bit because I'm someone who's not an expert in the psychedelic space, someone who's curious, wants to learn more from folks like you. But as someone who's a non-expert, I'm walking into the conversation, I'll be honest with you, with some stereotypes. I associate it with people who might be kind of edgy or bad, maybe artists that are using it to kind of just do crazy things or have problems, or maybe people that are a little bit close to the fringe of society. These are the stereotypes I'm not necessarily saying are true. If anything, I'm beginning to learn how untrue they are. But I wanted to talk a little bit about where these stereotypes come from as this show progresses. But maybe we could step back and talk a little bit about psychedelics themselves. People might be using them today for whatever reasons, but they came from somewhere. Talk to us a little bit about what you know about the origins of psychedelics in human culture.
Wow. So, just like kind of piggybacking off your initial introduction into psychedelics and those stereotypes, in all honesty, like those stereotypes are true in the sense of that they are stereotypes, and they're the stereotypes that I also inherited prior to doing my own research. So that's like a common school of thought, all around the world. So yeah, we want to change and break that narrative. And what you find is that a pastoral people who basically follow cattle from place to place as they graze the lands would come into contact with the byproduct of some of the gifts that these cows provide. And one of the gifts that the cows provide is their waste, their dung, and that which grow. You have what we call psilocybin or magic mushrooms that grow from the dung. So what you find within the mythologies of these groups, this is where we get some of the notions of sacred cows, holy cows, or these sacred cow cults or bull cults, because the gift that the cows provided was the psilocybin mushrooms that were growing from their dung.
How did you come to be interested in this world?
I was always interested in discovering myself, as young as I can remember, in nursery, primary school, secondary or high school education, as you guys refer to it, all the way through. I was a curious child asking questions, those same questions like, what are we doing here? What is the purpose of life? Like, what is this all about? And that led me to get into a stage in my life where I realized that school and education didn't give me those answers that I was satisfied with. So that inspired me ultimately to go and start doing my own research, doing my own Googles before Google at that time, but picking up books, doing research, learning about who are humans, where do we come from. And when it came around ultimately to psychedelics, because prior to that I was into like we all dream. I've been fascinated by dreams. Like, what are dreams? Like, why do we dream? Like, people dream the future. People prophesize through dreams. Dreams play a big part in world experiences. Like inventions have been provided to us by way of inspirations from dreams. So all these things I've always been interested in, studied them, and eventually got to a point where psychedelics kept on coming up as an option for curating altered states of consciousness, which I was fully aware now that was really key to personal development and growth. In my early teens, late teens, and going through that, puberty and so forth, for me, psychedelics was a no-no. Like all those stereotypes that you heard, like that's what I heard, like that's what druggies do, that's like not good. Just say no, just say no. So, and culturally where I come from as well, like as I matured, I became more comfortable in exploring, alcohol, cannabis, for example. These were, culturally accepted in my community. But beyond that, that was basically like what the white boys were dealing with. So I had to explore psychedelics several times as far as doing research and fully come around to understanding that I can't keep pushing this thing out the way because it keeps coming up, and you can't read about this thing, you can't watch a DVD about it. It's something that you need to experience, like sex. Nobody can't explain to you what an orgasm is. You have to have one to know. So I thought, well, at least let me experience this experience, and then make a qualified decision from then.
Talk to us a little bit about your own psychedelic journey. How did it change you?
Like I've had, starting from the beginning to now, I've had many different experiences, but ultimately on a base level, Scott, always highlight to people, it's allowed me to drop my load. Like on a personal level, I've been able to drop my load. There we have layers like onions, as people make reference to, and I used to carry a load with me around that didn't serve me well. So what it's enabled me to do is lighten that load. It's allowed me to look in the mirror and appreciate the good, the bad, and the beautiful ugly inside of myself. Like, it's allowed me to be comfortable in my own skin. This in itself was the liberation that I personally needed, that beyond traveling the multiverse and going here, there, and anywhere that you could potentially do on psychoactives, I think for me, that's the most important role that it's played in my human life, and that I would want to share or have others share in that experience. So you're no longer walking around blaming people, pointing fingers, making excuses. Like you know where you fit in this world, and that would be part of the initiation rites that you would have experienced as a teenager going through into puberty, where you wouldn't have got into your 30s or 40s having a midlife crisis, wondering why you're here. So this is like some of the offerings that these plants and technologies have to offer.
Darren, you're really touching on some powerful stuff here, because one of the things I've heard, this not via this podcast, but just on my own personal development journey, and you hear this a lot from people that are in the personal development world, which is that a lot of times there are existential crises that folks have about who they are and how they fit into the world, because a lot of the rituals that might have existed previously that were the gateways into your social role are gone. At the same time, we have an expectation, or at least the possibility out there, that people create a social construction of who and what they are in the world on their own without necessarily any tools to guide them. And sort of thinking about what you just said, I can't help but wonder, look, when I was 41, I had a midlife crisis. All of a sudden, I woke up and it was like, I don't know who I am, why I'm here, what I'm on this earth for. I didn't have the tools, nor had I had the mystery system initiations to give me any process for figuring that out. I can't help then but wonder if, to the extent that, if I'm hearing you right, some of these old mystery systems were incorporating psychedelics use into them, that having had access to them, might have even helped give me clarity when it came to that point in my life and I didn't know where I was going.
Yeah, for real. Well, for the most part, it suggested, like, it comes up many times, like, how young should, people be able to take psychedelics, wait till the brain matures, and, these kind of notions and narratives that flow around. But when you check out indigenous cultures, for the most part, still to this day, you're actually partaking in it pre-birth. So, like, a lot of the time, children are conceived under the influence of these sacred plants and technologies. The mothers, while they're forming the child in the womb, they're partaking in these substances, they're microdosing. When the child is born and being nurtured through the breast milk, the children are getting access to this. So at the latest, it would be when you reach puberty that you would have your first deliberate, conscious experience. You wouldn't have moved into manhood or womanhood without having the experience. Like, how dare you move into manhood or womanhood and not know who you are? That would be kind of like why the rites of passages were set up, for you not to be in your 30s and 40s, hitting that crossroads, hitting that brick wall, because you would have known who you are at 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. And you would have been given support and the tools to get you where you need to get to.
This is kind of paradigm shifting and mind blowing for me. I'm just keeping it real with you. So you're saying that in some of these indigenous cultures, and I assume you're talking in large part about Africa, but maybe elsewhere. So clarify as we go forward.
Africa, as well as Central and South America included.
Thank you. I appreciate that correction very, very much. So you're saying that literally, that would make sense if the mystery systems that people are engaging in include addressing issues like sexuality. And if they include psychedelics then therefore might incorporate it into the sexual experiences that are embedded within that culture. Obviously, then, if the child is conceived via a sexual experience that is under the influence of some of these psychedelics, and then the parents are continuing to use them as part of their mystery system practice, you're right. That would make sense then that these would be more deeply embedded in the culture and almost part of the development that anyone would have. Am I understanding all this correctly?
Yeah, that's how I understand it. Man, exactly how I understand it.
It's
And
kind of.
not everybody's singing from the same hymn sheet, but in principle, that's how it's been implemented in these cultures that utilize this. You see that, as I said, you're not moving into adulthood without having this experience, without stepping into yourself, without stepping into the cave, without climbing the mountain. These mythologies, these myths that are associated with you discovering the hero's journey. It's a lifelong journey, but we're going to give you the heads up and the tools that you need. So, as I said, you're not hitting those brick walls when you're in your 30s and 40s, asking, what you're here for.
Wow. I've got to say, when thinking about indigenous cultures or other cultures generally, it's so easy for an implicit bias to seep in. And I'm not saying this in some way to just be politically correct, but to say the assumptions about how a culture might operate are so defined by how we operate as a culture that it can be impossible to even imagine a cultural framework like the one that you've described. And so to me, and I would be shocked if I'm not the only one who is listening to this and kind of sitting here with their mind blown, because this is showing the extent to which every day people like me are walking around with cultural blinders on.
Oh yeah, most definitely. Because for the most part, we were all educated or miseducated by the same systems. No matter whether you're in the States or me here in the UK, the narrative that sets up these empires, these modern empires, to be the be all and end all and the peak of existence, the peak of humanity, and then we look back and say, well, what came before us was barbaric, was primitive, was ancient, is outdated. When in actuality, I had a conversation today for another magazine interview, and they were saying, like, for a perfect example being, it was like, there's this new wave, this newfound interest in mushrooms, as a whole, as far as the role that they play in society, the role they're playing in replacing packaging and clothing and things like this. And they said, like, this is all new. I says, no, actually, we're just coming full circle, because you're going to find out that, if you don't remember, that the clothing that original peoples were making were made from plant material. Like, all the things that we're saying we're advancing and getting back and are sustainable are the ways that we started. And our advancement in the West, that's now become the West, is actually more destructive. And then, as I said, we look back at these groups and think, they're primitive, barbaric, or whatever it is. But actually, they were a lot more advanced than we give them credit for. And there's still a lot more that we could learn from them, Scott.
How and why do you think that shift occurred, particularly with regards to psychedelics?
There's multiple reasons why, like, historically, there's always been, like a hierarchy of some sort. And all I can say is that over the years, it's become more corrupt. When, according to some of the original teachings that I'm hearing around psychoactive plants, there was a point in time where everybody had access. Everybody had the direct experience. Why was that? So we don't have a bunch of believers. You will know in the existence of a supernatural, so to speak, unseen world. You would have experienced, you would have engaged it, you would have interacted with it. You no longer have to believe. Once we create a hierarchy where somebody is speaking, engaging, communicating on your behalf, like a priest who is the one who speaks to God on your behalf, and you then have to deal with the priest, you then get people maybe who started off honest, but as we move through history, you see that it gets more corrupt and people are taking advantage of that. So it goes from everybody having a direct experience and having true holy communion to communicate with the holy, and then we come together as a collective, and that is a group divination. So I'm going to experience, Scott is going to experience, everyone's going to experience, and then we come back and we share our experience. experiences, and that becomes the group's divination. That gives us an understanding of who's who, what's what, and all the rest of it. But if now we're relying on one person or a handful of people to go in and report back to us what's going on, there may be somewhere down the line some manipulation taking place, and that's where we get the church and so many other things that came into play that were able to control or wanted to control the masses. So they replaced key ingredients that would allow you to have direct experiences, and were able to shift around, the dynamics and control the masses.
Well, you're raising some really fascinating points here, and I'm glad that you said that last set of sentences because I was going to dive into it no matter what you were going to say. You just happened to open the door more beautifully than I could have. So one of the things that's interesting then thinking about the church itself, the Catholic Church in particular, is that it has an intermediary between the divine and the lay person. The need to control who has access to the tools to the various tools that can give people a meaning, and the ability to control those resources could only, I would imagine, lead to someone being higher up on a hierarchy. And if that's the case, I can't help but wonder then if that was how some of the stigmatization of this began.
Yeah, well, from my understanding, that's how it's played out. Like even prior to the Roman Catholic Church, in the Greek mythology and Egyptian mythology and history, it suggests, like the priesthood became corrupt. That's that's the term I'm using. So over the years, it's got to a point where, as information's being passed on or being downloaded, human beings are like, how can we, like we do today, how can, like with mushrooms right now and psychedelics right now, how can I monopolize? How can I capitalize on this? Like people are not thinking about the people, they're thinking about themselves. So when you look at you personally being able to have a direct experience and communicating with, for lack of a better term or title, God or the creator or source or divinity, and you that being removed, because that's going to give you true liberation, it's going to give you your personal liberation, and now you're dependent upon somebody giving you your liberation. That's a big control mechanism there. And when we think of, for perfect example, I mentioned earlier on, the initial rites of passage that you see in ancient Egypt, for example, or better yet Kemet, known as the open of the mouth ceremony, was all about the initiate opening their mouth to partake in some substance that would allow them to have Holy Communion. Now the church are privy to this stuff because we celebrate Holy Communion in the church, for example, on a Sunday when the priest is coming into the space with his whatever else it is, and they're throwing around the frankincense. And today they're handing over wafers, as I understand it. And those wafers originated in Hebrew, tradition, by way of a term known as manna, which was this bread from heaven. So it's not mother's pride, it's not naan bread, pita bread, like it's this bread from heaven. There's a technology or information in there that connects you back to source so you can have true holy communication. That's what Holy Communion is meant to be. Now, when you check these various other groups around the world that still have their sacred plant technologies and fungi technologies, and they refer to their holy sacraments or their holy woods as the tools or technologies that enable them to speak with their ancestors or the spirit world or the creative forces, this is the same technology that the church holds, but they've replaced the active ingredients and given us a wafer. That's the control. That's how, we're role playing like we are communicating, but we're not truly communicating with all of the technologies that Earth has provided us to really being able to do that.
Darren, what you're saying, though, has profound, I would even argue, socially existential implications, to use some $5 words, which almost never come out of my mouth. And in terms of what those implications are, direct access to the source, to the divine, to our own ability to understand who we are and to connect to ourselves, the universe, and by implication of each other. If everyone were to have that in the social structure that we have right now, literally the social hierarchies that we operate in right now, I would imagine would fall apart because a lot of the intermediaries wouldn't be needed. Am I misunderstanding here?
No, it definitely wouldn't exist as we know it today. And this is primarily why they're moving beyond the church, then the government step in, in the modern world and issue the laws that will forbid people from accessing this stuff. That's the story, that's the journey. Like down the line, it's like, well, for us to keep control, we need to, keep this to ourselves. And that was how it started out, as these secret societies. But people had the knowledge and information around what it was, how to utilize it, and it might be used on special occasions, special ceremonies. It's not like an everyday thing that people are doing. In some cultures it is, but every culture is different, in that regards. But ultimately, as we move through history and time and get to a point in place where we now, the government replaces the church replaces those older traditions, and it's just got tighter fisted as we've reached further down in history as far as accessing the tools as well as the information.
But I have said to the audience in prior episodes, I'm always going to keep it honest here, and I'm going to ask guests the hard questions. And so there's a couple of hard questions that I've got to ask, because when someone is saying stuff with as far-reaching, and again, I'll be honest with you, mind-blowing implications is what you are, I feel obligated. I feel obligated to share that questioning voice. The first question I have is, well, okay, the sinister way of looking at it would be to say the government is attempting to control everything that you've just described. But couldn't it simply be as simple as, well, the government actually cares about our safety?
Okay, so one, I didn't say sinister. I didn't actually say, I'm not saying it's sinister acts. I'm just saying what the acts are. And I do believe in balance, yin and yang. Like, you need to have the hero, you need to have the villain. It's just like there's not one without the other. I don't see them as good or bad people. I just understand the relationship, the yin and the yang relationship in nature, these principles. So I'm not pointing fingers. I'm just letting you know who the villain is in the movie archetype, or who the yin is, versus the yang archetype. And when we move forward, we're saying that, yeah, there is some elements of, taking care of the masses, but I wouldn't believe that as in the be all and end all reason as to why they prevented the masses from accessing that. In this here and now, because we've been so far removed from this, yeah, we need to be educated. There's a lot of education that's going to be required, and that's what the initiation rites and the mystery systems were about. That was the education prior to partaking. Now that's been removed. We've got a bunch of people who don't know. So now, whether it's like later on down the line, the government might say, for example, okay, we've discovered now that it's not as bad as we thought it was, or it was painted to us, and we were just following protocol. So I'm not pointing fingers at anyone. We were just following protocol, just like at a job. If you're a mechanic and your boss says fix that car, you fix that car, but that could be a car of an assassin, and you've helped them, do a getaway. But like, you're just following protocol. That's just what it is. So it just is what it is in that regards. And normally, what I say to folks is, you've got to get in where you fit in. How do you feel about it, and then what do you do about that? And how do you go about educating yourself and educating others and telling the truth and shaming the devil? We're talking about science. This is like when we really break down the words. So when you look at panspermia, it will break down that we're looking at these asteroids, meteorites, and comets that brought key ingredients with them that kick-started life on planet Earth. So just like the key ingredients, like sunlight is really important to life on Earth, yeah? It's not from Earth. That sunlight is alien. Don't want to lose people. Like, that's alien. Water, which is the element that dominates this planet, is alien. It's not from Earth, according to science, according to NASA, not Darren, not ancient mythology, although they do attest to this. Science is suggesting that, yeah, the water on Earth came down in these big ice blocks and eventually, became the waters of planet Earth. And in these waters was key life, alien life, that kick-started the life on planet Earth, that we are an extension of that, because we came from the soil. That is, it suggested, earthlings come from the soil, we go back to the soil. All that we utilize to keep us alive comes from the soil. The plants, all the nutrients come from the soil. So it was the mushrooms that arrived, that broke down the bedrock, that created the first layers of soil and became the internet, became the infrastructure of the landmass to create soil that would allow plants 500 million years later to grow, and however many years later humans are evolving, an extension of this project. So it's science is talking this stuff, but I'd also encourage you to check out mythology and see how science is just catching up with mythology and how they mirror each other, and it's an amazing story to tell. I love telling it because I know it may throw people off because it's like, wow, it sounds like a Hollywood movie, but science supports this. We should have learned this stuff in school. That's why I'm actually currently teaching this to children in school. I'm employed by schools to teach people, young people, this narrative, because they know that it's actually scientific fact. But we wasn't taught this stuff in schools.
Really? Thank you for that very candid answer. I'm going to ask you tough question number 3, and then I want to get back to some of the main topics again, which is that these the information that was transmitted through these indigenous tribes way back when in their mystery systems. If it was secret, I know someone out there listening to this or watching it is saying, well, if it was such a secret, how does Darren LeBaron know this? So
Well,
what are you going to say to that, to my homie that's going to ask me that?
multiple reasons. There's people who've been part of these secret societies that have got a big mouth, and they got that's the first thing. Some of them, as we know, are no longer here because after their big mouth, they got taken out. But this stuff was recorded, and then in the rites of passages that I tap into, this stuff is actually encoded in your blood and your DNA. You know, and once you start partaking in stuff, you get, as I said, we naturally have access to this consciousness, this collective consciousness, as it referred to. Now, if you're comfortable in your own skin and you're comfortable in processing the information that you get, I don't need to believe. Like, I don't care if you don't believe me that spores came from outer space and came and broke down the bedrock created. So I don't need you to believe me that. I know what I know, and I'm also aware of what I don't know. So when I put all that together in a pot, I'll give you and present to you what I present. And I'm happy and confident to say, yo, these are areas that I don't know about. But between my research, my own life experiences and psychedelic experience, and I put all that in a pot, this is what Darren's presenting to you, man.
Well, and I've got to say, one of the things that you're saying, and I will say, irrespective of what someone believes about the origin of Earth or the creation of plants and all of that sort of stuff, the one thing that you're saying that has been echoed repeatedly in the stories of people who have had psychedelic experiences is related to this sense of connection, this sense of healing, this sense of, I would say, providential, or as you're saying, source or divine partaking on a deep level. And with that in mind, it's hard not to argue then that the implications of what you're talking about, opening that up to the entire population, could really change the face of human culture. I've got to ask this question with that observation in mind, or that line of thinking, which is, you like to focus a lot of your speaking and your service in the psychedelics world on underserved communities. Is this sort of idea that this is breaking free of social controls that may be limiting people part of why you do this, or do you have other motivations? And talk to us a little bit about that.
No, because being somebody of African heritage by way of the Caribbean who was born and bred in the United Kingdom, I was disconnected from my true story. You know, the hunter has been telling my story for as long as I know. So as a child, as I said, I realized that, and I've been wanting to serve myself. So when I see people who look like me, people who have gone through similar experiences to me, I feel their pain, I feel their experiences. So I speak for them from my perspective. They may not want me to speak on their behalf, but I speak that language, I speak that tone, I speak that frequency. It's no different from when I'm in, the work that I've done today. I do work for young people, and I speak on behalf of young people. Why is that? Because sometimes they don't have a voice, they're misunderstood. So I'm somebody who's got an ear to hear what they've got to say, and I can go out and speak on your behalf. But at the same time, I want you alongside me. I'm not going to speak on behalf of young people without young people being in the room and saying, yeah, I'll co-sign what Darren is saying on our behalf. So the fact that I do the work that I do, which is in this country, we call them the hard to reach communities. What I really identified is all these titles that you give these groups are actually the group that I come from, what I was born and bred into. It wasn't a choice of mine. It's just like the way the cards were dealt. So now, as and when I communicate with those people, it's not because I'm doing special work. It's like it's just the work that I've got to do because I come from those communities. Those are people that I see and interact with on a day-to-day basis. That's the world that I live in, that I'm from. So for me, it's not like, oh, let me do this extra kind of work. Let me do, because it's needs like that's the community that I'm from. That's where that when I get up and leave my doorstep, I'm in a community where there's drugs and gangs and this type of stuff going on. So if I'm working in my community, those are the people that I've got to serve. If I was, I don't know, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and I got raised in,
me.
like I would have probably a different approach into the people that I directly serve, in that regards. But I guess, as I said, it's the way the cards were dealt.
Well, Darren, one thing I'm a big believer of is keeping it real and being there for our homies. And that's exactly what I'm hearing with you. And I can completely relate to that. I really can. There's a lot I'm going to take away from this conversation. So much it'll probably take me a few days to fully process it. But before we close, one thing that I wanted to just say that will really stick with me is going back to an earlier part of our conversation. When you were talking about how these substances were integrated into the day-to-day cultural life of cultures, of peoples that are in a completely different place and time, my blinders have been on. And that really gets me to think about stereotypes across the board.
Sure.
And to what extent they're informing my life, particularly when it comes to the subject of this podcast, psychedelics, and how I'm viewing people that might be exploring that. So I want to thank you for that. If there is one or two set of last words that you would like to share with us today before we close out and tell people where they can find you, what would those be, Darren?
For sure. So, because we've hop, skipped and jumped in a few places, and I know if people are new to this information, it might throw them off a little, and you've got to go and do your research, you've got to go and do your Googles. That's what it's about. And I'll say that to say, because in the current narrative, in this psychedelic renaissance, as it's being referred to, psychedelics have been loaded with this medicinal approach. Like psychedelics for therapeutic purposes, psychedelic for anxiety, depression, PTSD. Articles came out in the last 24, 48 hours about psilocybin helping with alcohol recovery, alcohol addiction, and stuff like that. And this is really cool because, like I said, if I step outside my house right now, I'm going to come across some drug addicts, on opiate drugs, some people who are addicted to alcohol and stuff like that. That's the community where I live, where I'm from. But my questioning when I first started my research was, for example's sake, iboga. I'm not sure if you're familiar with iboga, but that was the one African psychoactive plant that I was introduced to when you go to the very popular psychedelic events and circuits, and when you do the research. And iboga is native to Central and Western Africa. That's where it's from. It's the only place you find it indigenously. It's native to these lands. The people are gifted this stuff by nature. And according to these people, because when I heard about ibogas from this region, if you was to type it in the internet right now, iboga, enter, what's going to come back in your top 10 list is that iboga is good for heroin addiction, alcohol recovery, trauma, and a list of other challenges that we have here in the West. So the first question that my spirit asked me to ask was, so do they have heroin addicts in Gabon, in the Congo, in the regions where this naturally comes from? No, they don't. That's what my research shows me. And later on down the line, I found out the alcoholics that they do have in these regions came in by way of the colonizers who introduced alcohol as part of the trade and stuff. But indigenously, no, they didn't have heroin or alcohol issues. So my question to myself to find out was, so what do they use it for? What do the people who it was gifted to say that these plants are for? And according to their own mythologies, just like many other groups around the world, and we'll touch on it just before we leave, is that iboga was introduced to the people so they could communicate with their ancestors. 101, nothing more, nothing less beyond that was the first thing that it was given to them for. This is the technology, these are the tool that would enable men to counsel the dead. If you then go to ayahuasca, which you find only in Central South America primarily, along the Amazon, you can go to all of these exotic tripped places and spaces and do your healing work and so forth. But if you get to the root of what the translation of it means, vine of the soul, or better yet, vine of the dead, the same indigenous people will tell you that this is a technology that enables us to communicate with the dead, with our ancestors, with the spirit realm. They are not talking about anxiety, depression, PTSD. These are challenges that we have in the West. So I'm just saying that to say that if the gatekeepers, the people who are gifted this stuff, who have the most knowledge and information about it, are saying to us, this is what it's for, and we're bypassing that and saying, no, it's just for therapy, it's just for this, and this is the way that it needs to be used in clinical settings, I think we're doing the plant technologies as well as the people themselves a disservice, and it's disrespectful. Like, that's where I'm coming in and stepping in my own Googles and research, saying, what is it about? What do the people who say it's about? And let's listen to them. Let's hear what they've got to say about it all.
Darren, this has been a genuinely fascinating conversation, and I'm so grateful to you for it. How can people find out more about you?
So fundamentally, you're going to find me at my website, darrenlebaron.com. All the social medias are pretty much that as well. Darren LeBaron at Darren LeBaron. Instagram, Facebook, and whatever other social media platforms there are out there. On the website, you'll be able to find out my upcoming events, the work that I'm currently doing online, in person. I've currently got a new webinar series that we're about to launch, which is called Psychedelics in Africa, The Untold Story, which is going to be like 8 hours worth of digital content plus resources and information that support that. And what we're going to do is start right from the beginning and bring it right through to the here and now and see where we're at now with it all, with an African-centered theme around it. And I do want to highlight, Scott, although I'm known for teaching and sharing about psychedelics in Africa, like I had a workshop just yesterday where we had 150 people there. And, outside that, it was a very diverse community. And there's people that I find from Ireland, Poland, Czechoslovakia, you name it, the list is endless, where they say, yo man, like coming to your workshop has inspired me to look into my own roots. What I've realized is that I fell for that psychedelic tourism kind of narrative that we're given, where I've got to go South America, put the feather in my hair, put a garb around myself and come back saying I'm a shaman. But really and truly what I've done has been, the grass may look greener, but I've kind of been denying my own connections, my own roots. And you've inspired me to look back into that. So me being of African heritage by way of the Caribbean, born and bred in the UK, but not having a direct link, I've been curious about that. I want to know who I am. And it's opened up that narrative for many others to kind of discover their English roots, to discover their Celtic roots, and then you find the sacred plant technologies that are from your region that have the information in there that is relevant to you and your people. I think that's really important. So yeah, that's what my workshops and online webinar series covers and goes into.
Again, breaking down stereotypes and building universal connections. Powerful stuff, Darren.
Right.
Everyone listening or watching, if you've enjoyed today's episode and want to learn more, be sure to subscribe and leave a review or comment and tell the folks that you care about what we're doing. Don't forget to follow Webdelics on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And be sure to check out our website, webdelics.com. That's WEBDELICS.com. And sign up for our blog to get more trusted educational information about plant medicine and psychedelics. Then join us next time for another episode of the Webdelics podcast.